Well, happy, very cold Monday morning. Yeah, it's Monday and not the weekend, which I normally post this members only episode on Saturdays or Sundays. So I am at least 24 hours late. The tricky part from yesterday or this weekend was that I recorded both sessions, both walking sessions. But unfortunately, the audio cut out on me on both occasions. Saturday, I walked down to Fifth Avenue. Actually, I walked down to Park Avenue, but stopped at Fifth Avenue and checked out the holiday. They dress up the windows on Fifth Avenue and a bunch of the retail stores for the holidays. So I walked down there to check those out, and then I had an appointment down off of Park Avenue. And they recorded another session on the walk back, which was mainly to the park. Yeah, unfortunately, that audio didn't pick up. And then yesterday's session was actually quite fun. It was snowing when I got out yesterday, and I did not, apparel-wise or footwear-wise, prepare accordingly. I learned my lesson. I certainly am today. But that was a good walk because the streets were pretty quiet. With the snow in general, just makes things quieter. But then the roads were a little icy, so there weren't too many bike riders out. Actually, not too many runners out either. I almost felt like I had the park to myself to some extent. And then today is the bitter cold that they talked about. So all that snow that fell yesterday, Saturday night, Sunday, is now frozen solid. And this is my first big boot wearing occasion this year. So I mean business. So I did take a bunch of photos yesterday. I'm going to use those in today's session too. So those will be posted on the Substack channel. Here's the snow scraper behind me. Yeah, I'm going to post those photos from yesterday in today's session. I think they look cooler yesterday anyway. Today's a little bit more drab. I went out a little bit earlier yesterday too. So I had to do a little tiny editing to the photos just to bring out some of the light. I think those photos turned out pretty well. My big focus yesterday when I was walking around was on like a historical alignment. So I might have mentioned before in an earlier episode of a statue, and there's so many statutes in Central Park. And for Seinfeld references, that's statue, not statute. Oh, there's probably a bunch of statutes too. But then one of the statues is a bust of Giuseppe Mazzini. It's right around the corner from Tavern on the Green. So in the park, kind of that 66th, 67th area. In fact, I think there's a walkway that goes right out to Central Park West, just right next to the bust. But I'll put a photo of the bust here. I'll drop a couple links in the description of today's episode too. I was doing a little digging around on our boy Giuseppe, just to get a better idea of who he was. And, from a leadership, I mean, he's got a bust in Central Park in New York City. He must have had some sort of influence on greater people. And that influence must have come in some sort of leadership, alignment, clarity in what he did. So Giuseppe was more than an aligner. He was a unifier. So his time was in the good meaty part of the 19th century. I think they describe him as a journalist, a politician, and maybe a little bit of a rabble rouser. He was born in Italy, got exiled at some point to London, lived in Paris, and then came back to Italy. This was at a time when Italy was, regionally was split apart. The great Roman Empire, and then these subsequent regions within Italy. However, there was no one Italy, and that's what Giuseppe was focused on, is unifying a one Italy. And even more so is understanding what the common man's, I wouldn't say rights, but maybe responsibilities in building a unified Italy. And realistically, any kind of unified region. So he called his efforts, at least initially, Young Italy. We see that in more modern day with like the Young Turks. I didn't mention it. It's about 8 degrees outside. I don't know. Maybe that's my disclaimer in case my voice starts to trail off a little bit. It is clear skies too. Clear. It's going to be a bright blue, sunny day. So Giuseppe thought that he could get the young Italians to mobilize and build a one Italy coalition. Wasn't based on class, wasn't based on religion. It was based on nationalism. I think nationalism today, that definition or that reference has been picked up by other groups and doesn't mean the same thing as Giuseppe's definition or reference meant. He wanted to literally unify Italy into a single country with its residents, its citizens having the responsibility of duty to your country. Right? Above all else, individualism didn't necessarily thrive in his view. Rather, it was a dedication to your country. So in today's parlance, he would likely reject the idea of authoritarianism, religious politics, algorithms for the sake of religious persecution to some extent, and rather the onus was on the individual to better the country, to better the nation. So in doing some of this research, naturally being in New York, I asked to compare and contrast Mamdani and Mazzini. And, realistically, could these two sit down and have a beer together? And ultimately, what would that conversation be like? What would the topics be like? What would they agree on and disagree on? And it looked like, for the most part, given what we know of both publicly, that realistically, they both probably would have liked each other. They both probably had the same long-term goals in creating a better community, creating a better apparatus to serve the common man, woman, child. Giuseppe's in creating a unified nation with the individual at the heart on both sides, right? And making the effort to better the nation as well as the nation serving those individuals instead of, an authoritarian monster who is in it less for bettering the nation that he dictates, and rather building a nation to better himself. And Mamdani, in the same light, trying to better, in this case, New York City, right? Listen to any Mamdani interview or conversation, and he will always bring it back to creating a better and more affordable New York City. New York for New York City residents. A better New York for New Yorkers. His political acumen in that sense is incredible, dedicated. And that's all he's publicly focused on. You could ask him about taking over as president or Senate leader, and he will not talk about that. He will only talk about what's in front of him and his dedication to New Yorkers. And you could think of that in Giuseppe's role too, his dedication to a unified Italy. And by extension, he did have greater plans in unifying Europe, a greater Europe, a young Europe, after his approach took over in other countries. So I definitely like that connection and thinking about both Giuseppe and Mamdani as leaders with clarity, and at least at the starting point, aligning individuals into a common goal, whether that's an affordable New York or a one nation approach bettered by the individual. I think where the nationalistic definition or reference started to change was likely within his own country. Benito Mussolini used that same one nation approach in his messaging and in his positioning. And I'd even argue that Stephen Miller today is using that same approach when it comes to his policies behind the Trump administration. I encourage you to check out the Substack, where we can create a dialogue around both Mamdani's leadership and messaging, and how that relates to Mazzini's approach to a one nation. In addition, while the images should show up in your podcast player, assuming your podcast player supports images, they'll also be on the Substack as well for this episode. This is the first episode that is behind a paywall. I'm certainly excited to start building out a media brand with dedication, ownership, and certainly responsibility as well. Talking about leadership and clarity and alignment. I hope it's warmer where you are, and thanks for joining.